The US President Donald Trump has reaffirmed his commitment to buying and owning the Gaza Strip. That's despite global condemnation of his remarks last week. So, what does the future hold for Gaza and the Palestinian people? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, Donald Trump made his millions from developing property, but in a series of outlandish claims, the US president says he wants to rebuild Palestine, making it into what he described as the riviera of the Middle East. The displacement of the region's population would go against international law. So, how serious is Trump about his plan?
The US will take over the Gaza Strip, and we will do a job with it too. We'll own it and be responsible for dismantling all of the dangerous unexploded bombs and other weapons on the site.
The statement that shocked the world. US President Donald Trump's proposal to turn Gaza into a riviera of the Middle East, reversing decades-long plans for a two-state solution, and the displacement of 2.3 million Palestinians from their homeland. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu embraced the proposal.
I've said this before, I'll say it again. You are the greatest friend Israel has ever had in the White House.
But Trump's plans have provoked his critics and long-standing allies.
In the search for solutions, we must not make the problem worse. It is vital to stay true to the bedrock of international law. It is essential to avoid any form of ethnic cleansing.
For Gazans, it's further heartache after 16 months of war.
We are staying steadfast in our land here. Who wants to rebuild should not kick us out under the pretext of rebuilding. Trump helped Israel in the first place in this destruction that we can see here.
If the US were to take control of Gaza, it would need cooperation from Arab states, which they have firmly rejected.
We emphasise that Jordanian national security dictates the inevitability of the Palestinians' steadfastness and their remaining on their land, and dictates the necessity that there be no form of displacement of the Palestinian people.
The day after Trump's remarks, the White House attempted to soften his words.
The president has not committed to putting boots on the ground in Gaza. He has also said that the United States is not going to pay for the rebuilding of Gaza. His administration is going to work with our partners in the region to reconstruct this region.
But Trump has not backed down, reiterating his plans to own the Strip. What's really behind the US president's comments? And what does it mean for the future of Gaza?
Well, let's bring in our guests. In Paris, we have Lara Elborno. She's a Palestinian-American international lawyer and activist. In London, we have Gunness, former Director of Strategic Communications at UNRWA. Currently, he is Director of the Myanmar Accountability Project. And in Washington, D.C., Mirette Mabrouk. She is Senior Fellow and Founding Director of the Egypt Programme at the Middle East Initiative. You're all very welcome to Roundtable. Mirette, I'll come to you first. President Trump calls Gaza a big real estate site. Please give me your reaction to his grand design for Gaza.
Generally speaking, people are spending a lot of time running around trying to decode President Trump's comments. But the thing is, he is a real estate man, and he tends to view things in those terms. In this case, you also want to remember that, almost a year ago, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, had referred to Gaza as a huge real estate opportunity. Right? So all of this is sort of coming in. So as far as the President Trump thinks, well, this is a large piece of land with, a nice beach and nice waterfront. And instead of having all this death and destruction, we just build some nice condos. Now, you also want to bear in mind that President Trump has a habit of saying things that sound fairly shocking, and really he's just using it as a negotiating gambit, if you like. However, in this particular case, if it is a gambit, I think it's going to backfire fairly spectacularly.
Lara, to you, given the suffering your people have endured for so long, how offensive do you find Trump's words and his designs on Gaza?
Well, I think it's terribly offensive. We cannot normalize proposals for mass atrocities as some form of a negotiating tactic. And the reality is that after 16 months of Israel's genocide in Gaza and the destruction of over 90% of Gaza's houses, it is true that Gaza needs to be rebuilt, but rebuilt by whom and who is to take, the profits of that development of Gaza? It's Palestinians that own Gaza. Gaza is Palestinian land. And if anyone is to benefit from the reconstruction of Gaza, it's going to be the Palestinians who live there, who are the owners of that land. This results from the ICJ's advisory opinion of July 2024, which affirmed Palestinian self-determination in the occupied Palestinian territories in Gaza and the West Bank. And in accordance with that decision, the only thing that Israel must do with Gaza is to unconditionally and immediately withdraw from it and the West Bank and allow Palestinians the freedom to determine their own future.
Chris, to you, your immediate reaction to everything you've heard from Trump about Gaza?
Look, it's the mass violation of international humanitarian law. Clearly, you cannot forcibly displace 2.3 million people, not least because Egypt and Jordan are clearly not going to have them. Clearly, you cannot acquire land by force. You cannot simply say America is going to have Gaza. That's clearly illegal. And on goes the list of illegalities. But I mean, the other serious point to make here is that it is setting a tone which is so antithetical to long-term peace in the Middle East. How do you think the Arab world, how do you think the Palestinians, how do you think those in whose hands the future of peace in the Middle East sits are going to take this, even if it is a mere negotiating tactic? And I quite agree, we can't normalize this kind of negotiating tactic. What does it say about the prospects for peace? So it's illegal, it's profoundly antithetical to Middle East peace. And as other guests have noted, it's incredibly insulting. The idea that people who've been displaced multiple times either have to submit to their homes being given over to American property developers or face all hell, or whatever the expression Trump used, that is outrageous. The idea that people who've been displaced, a dozen times and more, whose homes have been reduced to craters, who are now living in tents, if they're lucky, in areas of northern Gaza, facing mass starvation, death through disease and other things, that those people should now have hell unleashed upon them. What do these people think? Has hell not already been unleashed on the benighted and beleaguered people of Gaza?
Mirette, to you, you mentioned the son-in-law, Jared Kushner. How much of an influence do you think he is on Trump's thinking?
Right, so again, no one knows. We need to bear something in mind. What President Trump has said is illegal. You can make the case that it's immoral. And I'm being sort of totally unemotional here. It is definitely illegal. It essentially makes the US complicit in a war crime, although you can certainly argue that the US has been complicit in a war crime for the last year and a quarter, because the death and destruction wreaked on Gaza has almost entirely happened with US money, and more importantly with US diplomatic cover. So they have gotten away with it so far, and I think this is really the issue. I know you asked about Jared Kushner, but and I'll get to him in a minute. But I think we want to sort of take a look at something else. It has happened, and it has continued to happen because there has been no actual objection or resistance apart from the usual, yes, it's terrible, this is happening, from anyone else. They've been allowed to get away with it over and over and over. So when he comes along and he makes a remark like this, he doesn't really have any reason to think that people are going to rise up and quell him. Now, Jared Kushner is his son-in-law. He was a senior advisor during his first term. This term, he said that he won't have anything to do with it. But of course, everybody knows the importance that Trump places on family. But Mr. Kushner is, of course, deeply, deeply supportive of Israel. He's an avowed Zionist. But it is not just Mr. Kushner. Mr. Trump, President Trump is surrounded by people who think the same way. The majority of his new cabinet appear to be Christian evangelist Zionists. His new ambassador, the nomination for ambassador to Israel is Mike Huckabee, who only ever refers to the West Bank as Judea and Samaria, and has said that Mr. Trump is bringing change of biblical proportions to Gaza. Everyone around him thinks the same way, and the rights of the Palestinians are, I'm going to say, very, very, very low down on the totem pole. I mean, this was when he made the case. He said, "Well, they can just go elsewhere." It doesn't occur to him that essentially you move into someone else's house, tell them to get lost, and say, "Well, you can just go elsewhere." You are speaking in moral terms, and I really, really don't think that is part of the conversation for this administration. I think the question is going to be whether this is going to be a step too far, and whether the rest of the world, which to date has done very little, is actually going to do something about it this time.
Let's bring Lara in. Lara, Trump's plan would effectively kill the dream of a Palestinian state. And that is exactly what Benjamin Netanyahu wants, isn't it?
Well, if you remember, the first proposals for expulsion of Palestinians from Gaza during this genocide actually go back to October 2023, when a document compiled by Israeli intelligence was leaked proposing to expel Palestinians into the Sinai. This never happened, but Israeli leaders like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir have been aggressively advocating for what they call voluntary migration, which is neither voluntary nor migration, but an attempt to illegally depopulate Gaza of millions of Palestinians and to steal the land for Jewish settlement. I also want to remind, this isn't just a Netanyahu problem or a problem of his government. Israel displacing Palestinians from their land and preventing them from returning to it so that that land can be settled by Jewish settlers is how the state itself was formed. And now how it is trying to expand in violation of international law. It's doing the very same thing in the occupied West Bank, where we see Israeli settlers with impunity burn Palestinian homes down, kill livestock, threaten Palestinians, move into their homes. I mean, how many of us can actually forget the infamous, if I don't steal it, somebody else will, by a settler from New York named Jacob, who was filmed in an interaction with a Palestinian woman, Mirette, whose home he moved into without her consent. So look, Palestinians in Gaza will be going nowhere unless it is to exercise their right to return to their ancestral lands within the Green Line, which Israel has prevented them from doing for the last 76 years. And whether it's Netanyahu or anyone else, Israel, as long as it continues to act as a settler colonial regime organized under this principle of Jewish supremacy and Palestinian fragmentation and depopulation, then it's always going to behave in this way, regardless of who the leader is. And so the time is ripe for a new approach, for compliance with international law unconditionally, and for respecting the rights of the Palestinian people to freedom, like all people in the world deserve.
Chris, Trump is on record as saying that if the Gazan population had somewhere better to go, they wouldn't want to go back to Gaza. What do you make of that argument?
I mean, look at the hundreds of thousands of people who are returning to their destroyed neighborhoods in northern Gaza. Talk to any Palestinian, as I spend most of my life doing, and they will all tell you that they would prefer, after what they've been to go home and to die with a modicum of dignity on their land and with their families than to face a fragile existence on the streets of Cairo without papers or on the streets of Jordan. That's not going to happen. It is to completely misunderstand the Palestinian experience. And I think, I think it's important to say that Gaza actually is something of a sideshow, and that the clear plan is that the West Bank, like East Jerusalem, will be formally annexed. It seems very clear that Trump is giving a green light for that. That is what these settlers are moving for. That's what they're being motivated by. The key question, though, is how does particularly Saudi Arabia, but also how do the Arab states deal with this? Because if the deal of the century is going to be about effectively the Arab Peace Initiative, Arab countries guaranteeing Israel's security in return for a Palestinian state, a functioning Palestinian state, respect for Palestinian self-determination, which includes, of course, the right to return if they want to. If that's going to work, if we're going to get this deal of the century, then it's very clear that simply expelling the Palestinians from the West Bank is simply not going to work. And that's when it's going to start getting very interesting, when the Arabs actually step up to the plate, if they ever do, and start talking about their commitment to a Palestinian state. And for the rest of the world, there's the ICJ advisory opinion about the occupation, which we've already had mentioned, and that makes it an obligation on member states of the United Nations not to do anything which would make them complicit in an illegal occupation. When are we going to start seeing that properly implemented, a proper embargo, diplomatic, political, military, economic, of all sorts against Israel? I mean, those are the things that are going to have to start happening. So it's not over till it's over, but I think we have to wait and see how the Arabs respond. Not a lot of optimism here. And we have to call on all member states of the United Nations to honor their commitments, not to be complicit in Israel's illegal occupation.
Mirette, just on that point about other countries, big players in the region, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, how do you think they will react to this? Because I've got some words here from the Saudi Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They say of the Gazan population, they are not intruders or immigrants to it who can be expelled. So we're finally seeing some reasonably strong language from Saudi Arabia on this.
Right, so this is what I meant by if this was an opening gambit from President Trump, I think it's backfired. Truth be told, up until October 7th of 2023, I honestly think that particularly the Gulf Arab states were fairly relaxed about the Palestinian issue and were moving ahead with normalization because they want things from the Americans. They want military security agreements and stuff. And we're moving ahead and, we're not particularly worked up about the issue. I think the last year and a quarter has been difficult on these ruling regimes because of the reaction of their people. I think public opinion is overwhelmingly empathetic to the Palestinians. And I think the more Arab countries dragged their feet, the worse they looked to their people. In the case of, we'll take Saudi Arabia first. Saudi Arabia is a nation that President Trump really wants to bring on. He really wants to finish off the Abraham Accords, and Saudi Arabia is the jewel in that particular crown. This last move just pushed, I think, the Saudi Arabian government well past its ability to be able to absorb any more of this. And their language has actually been very, very strong. They said, we're not going back on this, and there will be no compromise. You want normalization, you clean up your act, you move towards a Palestinian state. The Jordanians and the Egyptians are in a difficult position, particularly the Jordanians. The Jordanians are already ethnically, more than half Palestinian. But and an influx of more Palestinians could wind up being extremely problematic for them. But they are in a very delicate position because they get a lot of aid from the Americans, almost 1.3 billion last year. And you want to bear in mind that almost 780 of that is budgetary support, which means they get it in cash, and it goes to paying teachers and policemen and doctors and all the rest of that. So they're in trouble. The Egyptians are in a different state. Now, people talk about Egypt getting billions from the Americans. They don't. Egypt gets $1.3 billion in foreign military financing, second only to Israel, gets 3 times as much. Okay, but foreign military financing is it's a coupon. You don't get any money. You get a coupon that you can spend in the United States on American armaments. Money never leaves the United States. In terms of economic aid, Egypt got 125 million last year. It's not a small amount, but for a country the size of Egypt, easily absorbed into something else. So it's not a matter of money at all. All right. Now, it could get ugly because President Trump could use his current favorite tool, which is tariffs and sanctions. And for 2 countries with poor economies, Egypt's economy is in a very delicate state at the moment. That could be problematic. Having said that, the Egyptians cannot budge on this.
Lara, to you, having ethnic cleansing on your CV as a leader, looking back on your legacy, I mean, that would be quite a look if he does push ahead with this.
Yes, of course. But let's be clear that also, Trump is picking up essentially where Biden left off. Biden greenlit the destruction of Gaza, and now Trump is seeking to profit off of it through this proposed ethnic cleansing plan. It's true that Trump may be more explicit, but it was under Biden, for example, that Netanyahu awarded gas exploration licenses to 6 gas companies for gas off the coast of Gaza in October 2023, just a few weeks into the genocide, to explore for hundreds of billions of dollars of gas within Palestine's maritime boundaries, without so much as a verbal condemnation from the Biden administration. That's just one example, but there are many. Look at the example of Rafah, where Biden had said that it was a red line, and then perhaps went back on it, and what ended up happening was that Israel invaded Rafah and it destroyed everything in Rafah, and Palestinians were once again forcibly displaced from their land internally. So I'm not terribly impressed with attempts to paint Trump as doing something different. He certainly does it in a different way, but this is really just an American policy of supporting Israel's violations of international law, no matter how egregious they get, for the purpose of empire.
Final point to you, Chris. Will all this be forgotten about in a few months' time, or do you think he's driven enough to push on and proceed and actually do this?
Look, whatever happens, this will not be forgotten in a few months' time, because there's now 50 million tons of rubble where Gaza once stood. There are 10% of everything that flew in, which we discovered when I was there for the 2014 war. 10% of everything that flies in is unexploded. So there's a massive operation, whatever happens, to clear the rubble and to clear the unexploded ordnance. Then there's the question of, winter setting in, mass starvation spreading. There's the question of how you deal with to fend off a humanitarian crisis confronting 2.3 million people, and then there's the other question of the emergency that's taking place in the West Bank, which shows no sign of abating whatsoever. And that's just on the humanitarian front at a time when UNRWA, the agency I used to work for, has now been effectively declared illegal, is banned by Israel, illegally, of course, because as we know from the ICJ advisory opinion, Israel has absolutely no authority in which to start telling a UN agency like this what to do, let alone privileges and immunities and the UN Charter. So no, there's absolutely no question that this is going to be forgotten. What we're going to see, I fear, is a deepening of the humanitarian crisis. We're going to see a ratcheting up of the rhetoric. It looks increasingly, though we don't know, as if the ceasefire plan may well not move from phase 1 into phase 2. It may be that Trump's threat of inflicting hell on Gaza. We may see some move in that direction. So, no, I think it's not going to be forgotten. And my real concern is that on all levels, diplomatic, humanitarian, militarily, things are going to worsen considerably.
Chris, just briefly, will anyone influence Trump? Is there any external factor that will make him just stand back and not do this?
I mean, the only hope is that those in his own MAGA movement will realize that actually MAGA is inherently anti-immigration. So, you know, some of the sort of Indian high-tech people around Trump, Musk himself, of course, is South African, maybe that they'll, you know, these right-wing ideologues will start to turn on themselves. Maybe, you know, somebody in America, the Democrats, you know, that maybe something will come from within. But it's very, very hard to see, given the unbridled sense of arrogant power which they've now assumed unto themselves. It's very hard to see what can possibly stop that, except disastrous situations unfolding on the ground, and then people simply over time learning through sheer bitter experience.
Chris, Mirette and Lara, thank you all so much for your insight on this one. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable, TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.